It's been estimated that an average U.S. household is paying an average of $900 more as a result of these new tariffs per year.
What is the history of the trade war between the US and China?
I think to understand the origins of the current trade war, we have to go back to the opening and reform era when trade between the U.S. and China was much less, right? So in 1990, it was about $6 billion of trade. The Chinese economy was smaller than Canada or Spain at the time. And there was a first round of trade conflicts in this period. And I think I want to characterize this era as a unilateral era of trade conflicts, right? So what is a trade war, right? Trade wars are when states escalate trade barriers to make it more difficult for goods from the other country to reach their market. Usually they're motivated by some perceived unfairness, some policies that are seen as hindering trade. So in the 1990s, the US initiated a wave of anti-dumping actions on China over things like IP infringement and state subsidies. And so that perceived threat to market access for China was one of the big motivators for why Chinese leaders wanted to negotiate for WTO accession. So that brings us to kind of the second era of trade relations, right? China exceeds the WTO in 2001, steep tariff cuts, regulatory overhauls, commitments to strengthen IP protection. And so while problems persist, trade expands dramatically. The political salience of willingness to restrict trade goes down somewhat. And that continues until 2009 after the global financial crisis. So you see a resurgence of trade actions under the Obama administration, narrow tariffs on tires, for example, anti-dumping goes up. There's concerns about currency manipulation, renewed worries about subsidies and so forth. But it was not until the election of President Trump and a few years into the administration, the launch of the Section 301 investigations, and which sort of laid the intellectual groundwork for the trade war, that things get very heated once again and politicized, right? So the approach to trade conflicts was in the Obama administration was relatively narrow and low political salience. By contrast, President Trump sort of campaigns on the unfairness of the trade deficit and jobs going to China and so forth. And so you see a high profile sort of major escalation of these tariffs that eventually resulted in 4 rounds of tariff hikes, and majority of goods that China exports to the U.S. are covered, especially for intermediate goods. China retaliates to these rounds of tariffs by imposing tariffs of their own on U.S. exports, and so average tariff levels go up, sevenfold in a few years, and they've remained elevated at that level. There was a brief truce, let's call it, a sort of a ceasefire in 2019 that was negotiated, where there was some hope that no new tariffs will be put into place, and then maybe they'll ratchet down the existing tariffs that are in place. But then the COVID-19 pandemic hits, trade and supply chains become even more fraught. I think in here in the U.S. and across much of the West, there's a lot of anxiety about the reliance on foreign suppliers for a lot of essential goods. There's a greater emphasis in China on self-reliance as well. So you have this spiral. And so the long story short, tariffs have remained in place. They've not gone away under the Biden administration. And in fact, the Biden administration is announcing a fresh round of Section 301 investigations, focusing on steel and aluminum, proposing a 3-fold increase of tariffs on this area. You have President Trump, who's running against President Biden in November, I think promising around the world sort of tariffs, and then 60% tariffs on China. So tariffs are going to be pretty big, I think, in this upcoming presidential elections.
Why has the US implemented tariffs against China?
Yes, so I think it's important to recognize that the motives behind the trade war in 2018, right, the outbreak of the trade war, I think there were mixed political motives that were involved, even for the Trump administration. I've written about this, and I think there are at least three sort of distinct motivations advanced by different members of the Trump administration, and they see tariffs as achieving very different things. So first, there were folks who, the more traditional people who work in trade policy, I think, including Ambassador Lighthizer at the USTR, viewed tariffs as a means to achieve leverage, right? So especially the threat of tariffs. And so there were the Section 301 investigations were about, a bunch of things that China was doing that the US doesn't like. High among that is support for these made in China 2025 industries, which is seen as distorting the playing field, market access for American companies and so forth. So, the threat of tariffs was meant to get China to change its policies, right, for some parts of the administration. Others in the administration, I think President Trump especially is in this camp, and I think large, why tariffs have popularity in Congress as well is considerations about the trade deficit. So President Trump has been obsessed with trade deficits since the 1980s, trade conflict with Japan, and with China. And the idea is, he thinks that it's bad for U.S. foreign policy that China exports a lot more goods and services to the U.S. than the U.S. gets to export, and so the threat of tariffs is meant to reverse that, right? And that's popular, I think, electorally, politically, because every member of Congress would like their people in their district to be able to sell a lot of things to China, and nobody wants competition of imports putting pressure on their manufacturers. So there's that component. That's a different logic than using tariffs as leverage, right? That's a protectionist logic where it's if we make it so that U.S. gets to export more and we take in less from China, that's a good sort of political thing. And then there's, I think, a national security consideration as well, that was present in the Trump administration and actually sort of expanded and I think now dominates the conversation, which is a belief that trade, whatever the redistributive consequences, right, is a national security concern because it is helping China grow, helping maybe the Chinese military acquire technologies, that it's not about who gets the benefit from trade, right, as the previous two are, right? It's about having less trade with China would be better. Why are we helping an adversary by transferring sort of wealth and technology and so forth? And so the trade war is a means to just contain sort of China or attrition, put pressure on the Chinese economy so that it does worse economically. Now, these are distinct sort of, I think, motives because they have very different end goals in mind. There's a really wonderful book by Davis and Wei and Wall Street Journal journalists, Superpower Showdown, that give the blow by blow of the trade negotiation process. But I think it translated into a log rolling of demands, right? I think it seemed very clear in retrospect that the Trump administration didn't prioritize between these kind of goals and different end states, and they just sort of made a maximalist demand of like, well, can you address like all of these concerns that we have, right? And I think that contributed to the failure of the early rounds of negotiations, where I think many people were optimistic that a trade war would be too costly, it would never break out, and the Chinese, right, when shown toughness, will make some concessions. And I think the historical record shows that China was close and they were willing to give sort of some concessions, but the book sort of shows that at some point they were like, well, what if this is sort of too much of an ask, right? And we can't give it now because what if they salami slice and ask more later? And so you have a hardening sort of a political will on both sides, and as a result, right, you don't get the kind of achievement that the negotiators would have liked to get, because with different end goals in mind, right? If you were willing to perhaps make some concessions in terms of reforms, if tariffs are used as leverage only, right? If tariffs are being used as punishment, and the idea is to, perceived to be the end goal is perceived to be some sort of economic or technological containment, then concessions are a sign of weakness. And so, right, how do you balance sort of those different motives? And so, as a result, I think the lack of clarity or prioritization about these different end goals resulted in a maximalist kind of demand and a bargaining failure. From a economic and I think strategic perspective, it's best to threaten tariffs, right, and exercise that leverage, and then get the concessions without actually having to implement those things and suffer the economic costs. And I think both sides expected the other to fold and ended up with piling on rounds and rounds of tariffs on each other. And I think that's essentially sort of where we're at today. And it's surprising in a way because I remember very clearly when I began working on this, like conventional wisdom was very clear that trade war probably not going to happen. Both sides should see that it's not in their interest, right? And it would be perceived as so bad for for the economy and therefore bad politically, and how far we've come from that and normalized these economic costs is surprising.
How have tariffs impacted the United States?
Yeah, this is an easy one. Tariffs are bad for U.S. consumers, but they are good for U.S. producers that are competing with those imports, right? And that's sort of how tariffs and protectionism works, right? But the harm in aggregate definitely outweighs the benefits, but that doesn't necessarily translate into the same politically, right? Into reducing them. So anecdotally, how do tariffs hurt consumers? Well, tariffs are taxes levied at the border on imports, and so they basically make goods more expensive. A lot of this is indirect because the tariffs are on inputs of things that are manufactured here in the U.S. But some of it is directly on consumer items. Anecdotally, I was bought a house and was starting my job here at KU right in the middle of the trade war in 2019, and faced some sticker shock for furniture. Right, a lot of furniture is exported from China, so there were higher prices and low stocks. There were items that were available on the catalog that were literally sitting on ships because of uncertainty over what the tariff rates are. And so either the retailer or the exporter was kind of uncertain sort of about when things are going to go into market. That's one type of product that's imported. You scale that across sort of a large number of products and you get sort of a sense of the cost. And it's been estimated that an average US household is paying an average of $900 more as a result of these new tariffs per year in aggregate, right? So distributed across all the things that you buy that are either imported from China or have a component that's imported from China. If you think about sort of how this works on the US economy as a whole, putting tariffs on steel, as the Biden administration is proposing to do, is going to help steel workers, maybe the steel labor union employed in that industry would be happy with less competition. But it means that it's going to make the users of steel in the US, so automakers, the construction industry, make steel more expensive and costs will increase for those producers. Similarly, tariffs on Chinese solar panels, right, are going to help a couple of US solar panel makers gain a larger market share perhaps, but unit costs for US made solar panels are 50% more expensive than Chinese competitors, the same sort of level of quality. And so as a result, your US solar installers and maybe households that are trying to get solar panels on their roofs are going to pay a higher cost. And that might delay the green transition, right? So that's the balancing act that's involved. It helps some sectors of the economy, it hurts others. Another problem, I think, with tariffs is that they don't change the underlying competitiveness, let's say, of the US steel industry. I grew up in Pittsburgh. You just drive to Braddock and you can see the dilapidated state, the aging sort of equipment and the U.S. Steel Edgar Thomson works there. And there's a tremendous need for injection of capital to update sort of the equipment and so forth to be able to compete against Chinese steelmakers on cost. Now, tariffs, I think, will reduce the incentive to either consolidate or need for investment because it's a little bit of a lifeline for these industries that are not able to compete without government support, but it doesn't change the nature, right? It's not giving support directly to the industry. And research by Cato has shown that there's no change in the employment in the steel industry after the Trump era. Steel and aluminum tariffs were imposed, and they argue that there's been a loss of jobs in the manufacturing sector as a whole, right, for all these users of steel products. So that's a problem, right? So it doesn't, it may protect sort of a sector of the economy by reducing foreign competition, but that reduction of competition doesn't change the underlying competitiveness of the sector. And finally, I think tariffs help lawyers and lobbyists. And so, I have friends who are lawyers, so that's nice for those folks, right? But the opacity of the tariff exclusion process has created a record levels of lobbying in Washington, D.C. And there's been work, including work that I've done, that shows that this helps large players that, right, there's a fixed cost to lobbying, right? So if you already have the means to influence, if you have a large law firm in D.C. on retainer, that could help you. You might be able to navigate sort of this process and might be excluded from, paying for some of these tariffs. But it's going to hurt small and medium enterprises that don't have that capacity or know how to do it that previously wouldn't need to, right? They can just source from wherever is globally competitive. Now they have to face, right, this additional hurdle. And so tariffs, in short, right, it has a bunch of these redistributive consequences, and then in aggregate, right, it's creating costs for both consumers and businesses, especially on small and medium-sized businesses here in the US.